Yo, 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 got an interesting video today. It's pretty long, so I'm gonna cut it here and there. You know the drill. Let's roll the clip.
This is what we've done in our society. We have turned things like anxiety into mental disorders and then made mental disorders trendy. And that's what prompted me to tweet the following thought last night. I said, quoting myself, "One of the worst things to happen in modern times is the medicalization of the human condition. Now people who experience anxiety think they're sick. They aren't. Anxiety is a fundamental fact of human existence. It is not a disease."
Okay, so you can see where this is going already. I'm going to cut out some of the backstory, but basically Matt tweeted saying that anxiety should not be classified as a mental disorder. And then he got a lot of backlash for it, so he's making this video trying to justify his claim. So a lot to unpack here. He tells a story as well about someone else bragging about having anxiety, but that's not important to the video. Now, given the context of what he's saying, it's not very easy to deduce what kind of anxiety he is talking about. Because if you're talking about just anxiety you get from, say, stressors in life, then sure, it's a thing everyone experiences. But if we're talking about anxiety disorders, then yes, that is indeed a medical classification. And I've seen a lot of people go around trying to claim that certain mental conditions such as depression or anxiety shouldn't be a mental illness. And they always fail to make this clarification and attempt to lump everything together. The truth is, there isn't one type of anxiety disorder. The line can be pretty blurred here and there, but you should never really treat two cases as the same. And that's where this guy's flawed opinion starts. He lumps all anxiety together and fails to see that some people actually have an anxiety disorder, which very much is diagnosed clinically. So no, I don't agree with your statement whatsoever because it's borderline ignorant.
We have set out to medicalize and diseaseify every aspect of the human condition, every difficult emotion, every unpleasant personality trait. That's why the DSM now has something like 300 mental disorders listed, and over 50 million adults in this country have been diagnosed with at least one of them.
Okay, so small correction. There are about 200 mental conditions that have been properly classified. About 51 million Americans have them. Don't get me wrong, just because there are so many mental conditions does not mean they are equal in severity. Some of them don't significantly decrease your quality of life, while some can actually improve your life to some degree depending on how you look at it. But of course, that doesn't mean you should underestimate the ones that really do have negative impacts. Many of the most common mental diseases truly are terrible, such as major depressive disorder, dementia, or anxiety disorder. Seems to me like you're trying to brush them all off when in reality, you shouldn't really do that. Now, from my scientific point of view, I think these are indeed justified in their classifications. Some others may perhaps be less clear, especially ones that are borderline psychology, but the point is that each of them should be looked into at an individual basis. To dismiss all of them, or at least imply that through your statement, is just generalization.
Almost everyone who's chimed in and contributed to the discussion has been of the opinion that I am wrong, and not only wrong, but a filthy, worthless piece of human dirt for even daring to say something like this out loud.
Okay, so I just pulled the tweet up and had a look at it. I always find it funny when people try to write intelligent tweets like this, when in reality they really just don't know what they're talking about. Do I think you're wrong and should be ashamed for spreading misleading information? Definitely. Do I think you're a filthy piece of dirt? Well, honestly, I don't know you well enough to make such a judgment. However, if I were to judge you solely based on this tweet, then maybe it's too much of a stretch, but I'd say you're halfway there. When I talk to other scientists about topics like this, we always keep it professional. That's what science is. Discussions should be as objective and as scientific as possible. So when I read something like this, which is clearly not meant to facilitate scientific discussion, but rather to spread your personal agenda to feel a sense of moral superiority, then that makes me think you're at least halfway to a pile of dirt. Because there are people out there who suffer from anxiety disorder. These are people who need help and medical attention. So you coming out and saying it's fake and they're just being a little bitch really does not help anyone.
Now, I'd like to explain my point of view a little bit, but I want to be clear before I do that this explanation is in no way an apology. I don't apologize at all. I'm really happy that I said what I said, and I couldn't have been more right about it. And if you're someone who reacts to an honest opinion by screaming and crying and ranting and raving, the problem is you. You, in fact, owe me an apology for being so unreasonable and annoying.
This guy is just so full of himself. People who adamantly think they're right and that the world revolves around them, I've seen it before. These are the same type of people who can't imagine even just the faintest possibility that they're wrong. And the thing is, I've been in this position before, back when I was, I don't know, in high school or something, before I got into science. I thought some of the mental disorders were overblown and that people who declared they were diagnosed were just exaggerating or something. I had the same mentality of, oh, everyone experiences depression and anxiety. You're just whining about something that everyone goes through. But as I learned more and more and got more into scientific thinking, reading scientific literature, that's when I realized that these are real mental conditions and they happen to real people. Being open to new ideas is part of growing as a human being, and it's part of science as well. So you telling people that they owe you an apology is very immature and incredibly dishonest, but you do you, I guess.
So I accept your apology. You are forgiven. I have been accused of stigmatizing mental illness with this opinion. I'm told the same whenever I argue that ADHD is not a real mental illness, which it isn't. Not a real disorder, which it isn't.
I'm actually going to refrain from responding to the ADHD part since there's a lot of video to cover, but honestly, you should at least read a few bits of scientific literature before making such a claim. Also, sure, this isn't necessarily stigmatizing, I'd call it dangerous ignorance instead.
I'm also not minimizing anxiety. I'm not stigmatizing or minimizing. Just because it comes with being human doesn't mean that it's any less painful, difficult, sometimes overwhelming. Neither am I saying that those struggling with their anxiety shouldn't seek help. Again, just because anxiety is human doesn't mean that we should wallow helplessly in it.
Okay, sure, but you have to reconsider your wording then. You are saying that it's part of human existence. You are saying that everyone experiences it. In other words, you're implying that these people's anxiety disorders are no worse than the anxiety that regular people experience, and that is completely wrong. You also mentioned in the tweet that medicalization of these conditions is, quote, one of the worst things in modern times. Absolutely ridiculous if you truly believe that. I can think of a million things worse than that, including the fact that idiots like you exist, but what can you do about that? Anyway, back on topic, these people truly do experience something different than the regular person. Let's educate a little on what exactly anxiety disorder is, since you've clearly not read any scientific literature whatsoever. Anxiety is a classification of multiple mental disorders that share the fact that they cause uncontrollable anxiety and fear. Even the smallest thoughts could provoke such feelings, including just having a train of thought, seeing a phobia, small events that happen nearby, and even things that aren't specific, such as just the general fact of existing. This is already much different than your normal definition of anxiety. Disorders that are classified under the broad umbrella of anxiety disorder include phobias, panic disorders, PTSD, etc. Then we can also physically define these disorders as well, depending on which ones we're looking at. More on this in the next section.
I'm simply arguing that we have made a category error. We have placed anxiety, along with many other human emotions and experiences, like, for example, despair, into a medical box when it doesn't belong there.
In my recent videos, I've been trying to go a little less hard on the science since I know they are difficult to understand for most, but this time I do have to speak science a bit. Feel free to skip this section if you don't want to hear all the scientific jargon. Anyway, anxiety disorder is indeed very broad in its definition, but specific types of anxiety and even general anxiety disorder has been biologically classified. Now, I'm not talking about diagnosis specifically, which is more based on questionnaires which rely on someone's subjective experience. Rather, we can see certain physical and genetic differences between someone with and without anxiety disorder. We've studied this in many angles. For example, there is a greater disconnect between the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex, two areas of the brain that is basically responsible for certain emotional responses and their processing, as well as the thalamus and other regions. But other than physical differences, we've also mapped out genetic differences too. If you just research around in literature, there have been multiple studies that have looked at this and have associated familial anxiety disorder to at least be a significant proportion of cause. For example, serotonin transporters 5-HT and 5-HTT is cited in multiple articles, since they do have a say in regulating serotonin neurotransmitters in the brain. A locus on chromosome ARM7p is found to be linked to panic disorders, while a chromosomal duplication could be linked to phobias. Other papers and literature reviews have cited the neuropeptide S and oxytocin receptors. Receptors and regulators of neurotransmitters are obviously very common findings. A scan of single nucleotide polymorphisms within the human genome has also had significant findings. For example, a SNP on chromosome 8 correlates with anxiety disorder phenotypes. Or actually, we can go to one of the largest SNP databases, SNPpedia, and find multiple single polymorphisms, such as RS4606 located on chromosome 1 having good influence on childhood temperament, adult personality, brain function, and a good correlation with an increased risk of general anxiety disorder at a p-value of 0.026. Seriously, SNPpedia is a great database that everyone should check out, and it even succinctly summarizes research involving around each SNP. Other SNPs in the database that has been shown to be correlated to some form of anxiety disorder include RS140701, RS4570625, etc., etc. Feel free to continue researching these yourself. I have included some links in the description for a start, and you can continue from there since many of these pages include the scientific papers that reach these findings. Anyway, that being said, the point is, there is indeed a genetic component, and while it's not fully understood, we do know that some people, when mixed with potentially some environmental factors, could cause something very abnormal in the brain that leads to someone having excessive anxiety. So in other words, these people do suffer from anxiety to a greater extent than the regular person. Please do not group them together. This is not just, quote, part of human existence, like you preach.
The idea that anxiety is a fundamental fact of human existence, a defining fact, actually, is not new or bold. Only the last 18 seconds or so did we decide as a country, as a society, to start treating these things as psychiatric disorders. Prior to the medicalization push, what I'm saying about anxiety has been said, or something very close to it has been said, by many people much smarter than myself and much smarter than you probably all throughout history. That doesn't mean that I'm right, but it does mean that if you're shocked by the idea that I present here, if you react to it like it's absurd or outlandish, then I have to suspect that you really haven't thought much about it or read anything about it. If you'd spend any significant time reflecting on anxiety and reading what others have said about it throughout history, then you certainly would have encountered my point of view many times.
I don't know who would be shocked by what you said, to be honest. So many people have said it. You're not the first to say it, and you're also not the last. But if you're spending your time reading about what people in history have said about anxiety, then personally I think that's a huge waste of time. You should be reading scientific literature instead. The fact of the matter is, we know a lot more now than, say, 100 years ago. And this also brings up your point about mental illnesses only being recently classified. Well, that's because, guess what? Science improves. Not just the methods behind it, but also the technology. All those SNPs and genetic components I talked about earlier, you couldn't even dream about finding those before we had the technology. As time passes, we realize that there are actual mental conditions, and as a result, we need to classify them as such. This is not to facilitate any political point or propaganda. It's just science and scientific tools. Thank you everyone for watching. Shout out to Fireshard, Alan Morton, and Miss Fixit for their support on Patreon. Bye bye.